We know that back in the mid-1970s, immigration laws changed here in the United States, and since that time, folks have been flooding to the city of Houston. They've come from all over the world. We've spoken many times about the significant amount of growth and diversity that's taken place in our city. I came here in the late 1980s and have been able to watch the kind of growth and diversity here, particularly as the nations have moved into our neighborhoods. Today in the greater Houston area, we've identified about 350 plus different ethno-linguistic people groups, over 220 plus different languages that are spoken. And that number just keeps growing and growing and growing. Next year, we're going to update our research and have new numbers to share with you, and there's no telling what we'll be able to report once we have the new research. As I moved into the position of Executive Director of Union Baptist Association, I'd lived in the city for a number of years. I'd watched it change. And as I moved into this position, there was kind of a marker moment in my life. I was in Taiwan. I was getting ready to come back to Houston. And we were getting ready to move into the role of Executive Director. While I was in Taiwan, I was up late at night because of the time change and my body hadn't quite adjusted. And across from the area where I was housed was the University of Taipei. And I went over and started walking around the track way in the middle of the night. I was amazed at how many folks were up at that hour and out doing the very same thing that I was. And though I was with a crowd of folks, in a very real way, I was all alone, because I was in another part of the world, halfway around the world. I didn't speak the language. I didn't know the customs and culture, didn't fully appreciate the sights and sounds and smells and foods and tastes. It was just a different world for me. And as I was walking around the track, I really do believe the Lord prompted me with the thought that, Houston is becoming a world-class city. And I was raised with the idea that church growth was around the homogeneous principle that everything, all my training was around how to grow a church of folks that looked, acted, and talked like you. But while I was over there, I realized Houston wasn't that way anymore. And I needed to learn how to think like a missionary. That was the big kind of transition for me. When I came back to Houston and started exploring that as a possibility, I talked with all sorts of folks about learning how to think like a missionary. And the more I talked, the more frustrated I became because nobody could really help me figure out how to do that in this context. I found out about training between the International Mission Board and the North American Mission Board that was taking place in London, England. And there they had kind of a modified training, they called it strategy coordinator training, that they were going to do for key leaders from the United States to put them through some of the same training that they put their missionaries through. So I kind of nudged my way into an invitation and was invited to come, next to the last person to be allowed to come and participate. And I want you to know that became a marker moment in my life. My life changed after those 3 weeks. And when I came back, my perspective was different, my thought pattern was different, my passion was different. And it not only affected me, it began to affect the staff. And before long, we even repurposed the association. We said that we need to start thinking like missionaries. We need to be the lead mission agency for reaching the city of Houston. We did kind of a total repurposing of the association. And it's changed who we are. It's changed the way we think. And then I began to try and train pastors to think like missionaries. And we've done all sorts of things with the demographic research that we do, with the identification of people groups, with conferences on various avenues of what do we need to do to reach cross-culturally and reach people to think differently. So we've tried very much to equip you to do that. But this morning, we're kind of taking it a little bit different. A little different direction, kind of another step forward. I've invited a couple of friends who are UBA pastors that were missionaries on the foreign field that have come back to Houston, and one is planting a church and the other assumed a pastorate from a church that had been transitioned. Buddy Brents came and he started Church for the Nations. And so he's coming as a church planter. Jonathan Williams came to Alief area and to Wilcrest Baptist Church, followed Rodney Wu, and he is a pastor there. And both of these men are working with intentionally cross-cultural international congregations. Now, I'm not holding that up as the model and saying that that's what everybody needs to do, but I've asked them to come, share with us their experience, and to prompt them with some questions about what they learned on the mission field, how they're putting that into practice here in Houston, and what kind of a difference is that making. So, Buddy and Jonathan, if you guys would come on up, I would appreciate it. So first, I just want to say thanks for coming this morning, and want to ask each of you to kind of introduce yourselves to us. Tell us your story, your call to ministry, where you served, where you are right now. Just begin by letting us get to know you a little bit better. So, Buddy?
We're from Texas. I'm native Texan. The Lord called us to Japan to serve with the International Mission Board. We served to Tokyo for 16 years. Loved our work there with the International Mission Board. I served as a church planter, strategy coordinator, and the volunteer coordinator for the city of Tokyo. For education purposes, the Lord brought us back to Texas, well, to America. I was here in Texas, and then the Lord took us to Mobile, Alabama.
Another cross-cultural move.
Yes, for real. I mean, seriously, I thought it was called Mobile, Mobile, Alabama. Actually, I hadn't heard much of it, but the Lord brought us there to serve as the director for international ministries and church planting. And I served with the North American Mission Board, a partnership with the state and the local association. My assignment was to reach the 66 different people groups that lived in our city. We were the only refugee city for Alabama. I learned so much in that time, just seeing the different nationalities, such a contrast from Japan. After that, the Lord, we actually started a church in Mobile. It was a multi-ethnic, multicultural church, and it was just a little bit of heaven. It was just seeing 11 different nationalities worship together, many of them, and we did it in such a way where we could reach first generation people that worshiped in their language and second generation people that worshiped in English. So it was meeting the needs of the family. Well, after that church plant was completed, the Lord brought us to Houston, and here we are. The Lord said, do it again amongst the most diverse city in America.
All right. Thank you. Jonathan?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Texas and gave my life to Christ right before I entered college. And during my years in college, I feel like the Lord cultivated within me a heart for missions. I had a lot of good discipleship around me, and people were just opening my eyes to God's heart for the nations. And so I had a chance to serve with some different mission trips throughout college. But after I graduated, I had the chance to serve with the International Mission Board as a journeyman. And so I spent 2 years in Peru on a team called the Extreme Team. And our goal was to take the gospel to the unreached tribes of the Andes Mountains and the Amazon jungle. And so for the 2 years that I lived out there, I worked with the unreached tribe called the Amara Kaeti. And so we lived in the jungles with them for 2 years. And God continued to kind of grow and mature that heart for different nations. And I learned a lot. I was very humbled to be out there. But during that time, as we started to plant churches in those tribes, I feel like one of the things that happened in a very significant moment in my calling is God moved from just loving the nations to also loving the church. I think maybe seeing the church stripped away of everything else and just seeing this simple hut church where it's just brand new believers gathering together as a church. For the first time, I can say I truly fell in love with the church, and I became very passionate about the bride of Christ and the calling that all of us have to prepare the bride of Christ for His return. Mm-hmm. And so when I finished my time at the IMB, I came back to Texas, and God gave me a wife, and I went to seminary and was planning a church in Fort Worth. And the whole time, my wife and I expected that God would send us overseas together. Because we both had a heart for the nations, we both had a love for the church, and we wanted to do that together overseas. And so back in 2010, one night, my wife and I were having our own just kind of prayer time, and we felt like the Lord spoke a word to us saying, I'm about to send you to the nations. So we thought, okay, after 5 years of waiting, we're going to move overseas. Finally, He's about to open that door. And I guess long story short, God started to turn our heart toward a church in Alief, Texas, right here in Houston, called Willcrest Baptist Church. I'd heard of the church before, and the only thing I knew about the church was that it was the nations. Pastor Rodney Wu, who was there for 18 years, led it in a transitional time to go from a homogenous church to a multi-ethnic church of more than 40 nations. And so it was a 6-month period of prayer and fasting and seeking the Lord's leading. But in the summer of 2011, God called me here to pastor Willcrest, and He did, in fact, send us to the nations.
He did.
Give us a place where we could invest in the church at the same time. So,
all right. Now, tell us a little bit about the training that you received that prepared you for the mission field.
I think, one of the biggest blessings I received that I continue to use today, the International Mission Board, their training and just being overseas, I think was this idea of simply seeing the nations, being in a place where you're wanting to get to know them, and then being open to different ways of sharing the gospel based on how you learn about their culture. So, for example, when we were in Peru, these people didn't have the Bible in their language, they didn't read, and so learning how to share the gospel orally through chronological Bible storytelling, something that I still use today, something I used this past Sunday in our church here in Houston even, just a way to communicate the whole gospel picture to different nations that translates different cultures. But also, I think I'd never even heard the term worldview before I served at the IMB, but just this idea that people from different cultures, they see the world differently. They approach the gospel differently. They approach life and family and church differently. They celebrate differently, mourn differently. And so that's been good. And one of the things that I shared with our church even recently is when you're around the nation, something that I always try to hold on to are these 3 prayers. One, asking God to open up your eyes to see the nations. 2, asking God to open up your heart to actually love the nations. And then 3, asking God to open up your hands to engage the nations. And so we want to see them for who they are and where they're coming from. We want to actually love them for who they are. And then we want to engage them where they are. And so that's something that I continue to, tattoo on my heart, even here in Houston.
Mm-hmm. Buddy, I know you served in the role of strategy coordinator and other things. What kind of training did you receive? Jonathan went to seminary after he served. You went before, right?
Yes, that's right. SE training for me was life-changing as well. Taking Matthew chapter 28.
You better explain what SC training is.
Yes. SE training stands for Strategy Coordinator Training, and the whole purpose of it is to give missionaries tools to reach cross-culturally, to see that our target, our goal is the gospel for the whole nation, for the whole people group. And knowing and understanding that perhaps your language is not enough, your cultural understanding is not enough. So how do we reach a whole people? Well, it helped me realize this. Strategy coordinator helped me realize that taking Matthew chapter 28, verse 19, go and make disciples of all nations, is the strategy for reaching the world. It says, go and invest in people, invest your life in people, and train them to do the work. Who better to reach Japanese people than a Japanese person? So teaching them to disciple others, and that whole simple concept of helping some other nationality reach their own people just really kind of changed my view on, wow, as a gospel witness, as a gospel sharer, I don't have to do it all. I'm here to, one of my purposes is to equip others to do the work of the ministry, to share the gospel, to make disciples, and watch God do it through them because they're better equipped with language and culture.
Now, you went through strategy coordinator training. You talked a little bit about worldview. I know one of the primary issues in serving as a missionary, one of the things that defines a person as a missionary is that they cross over the cultural barrier. They move outside of their life experiences, their culture, their worldview. They cross over that barrier. I know Acts 1:8 reminds us that we're to go, and then Jesus starts basically mentioning many barriers, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the uttermost parts of the earth. But with all of that, he was not just talking about geography. He was talking about, you've got to cross the racial and ethnic barrier when he talked about going to Samaria, going to the uttermost parts of the earth. He was spinning this out further and further. Let's talk a little bit about that big barrier of crossing over culture. I didn't know I had culture till I got out of it. And we don't. I mean, I grew up, like most folks, thinking that everybody thinks like I do. Everybody sees the world the way I do. So when were you first really introduced to the idea? You talked a little bit about it when you got to the Amazon or to the Andes. You talked a little bit about it through some of your training. But flesh this out a little bit more. What does it mean to cross over that cultural barrier? What do we need to know? What do we need to do? What assumptions do we need to make?
Yeah. I was going to say, I think it's an ongoing thing. I think every week I'm reminded that I'm coming from a certain point of view, a certain cultural background that maybe is more cultural than anything else, and I shouldn't impose that on everybody else. And so I think simply recognizing that I have a worldview and they have a worldview. It's not that one is right and one is wrong, but it's just different worldviews. I think that first, acknowledgement is a great step. I have a friend who's a missionary in Poland, and he said a thing that I always remember. He said, "Let your observations lead to questions, not conclusions."
Ooh,
and I think
good.
a lot of times we observe things that cultures do and make all these conclusions and assumptions. Well, that means this and that means that, instead of provoking a question and saying, why do you do that? Why do you take your shoes off before you go into the house? And why do you celebrate your anniversary this way? And why didn't you acknowledge anything I was saying while I was preaching? Why'd you just sit there and stare at me? And, let your observations lead to questions, and then you start to get to know the worldview. But I think it's an ongoing learning process.
That is, I think that's where we have to start, is we have to realize that culture is not right or wrong. I mean, the gospel transcends culture. And yet our starting place is usually fear. We're afraid. And when one day in Japan, we heard the drums start beating. And so these people were walking down the street, and we looked out there and saw them. They were beating the drums, and they were going, da, 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 and they were saying all these things in Japanese, and I had no idea what they were. It was very old Japanese. And then they were also waving these lanterns, and these lanterns that had fire, and they were carrying a torch with fire on it. And the first thing Melanie and I did was, we got to pray for them. Let's pray for their salvation. This must be some ritual, or they're trying to just keep the community in bondage. And so we emailed all of our prayer partners and said, please pray for these people that are down the street. This was going on for a month before one day Melanie and I were walking, and it was our habit to prayer walk at night, and we came across them. And we got up our nerve and came up to them and said, "What are y'all doing?" And We talked a little bit before, but the main point was, what are y'all out here for? And they said, oh, we're with the fire department. We're doing fire safety education. Really? Oh my goodness. My assumption was that they were with the Buddhists or something, to go out here and, anyway, our viewpoint is, that's a scary thing. And they're people. They just are normal. They've got families. They love their families. And the gospel transcends culture and race and nationality.
One of the things you said, I think, is really important for us to underscore. I loved what you said about, when you see something that's different, let it lead to a question, not a conclusion. I love that. But just the idea that culture is, it's our way of seeing the world. We all have it. It's not that one is right and the other is wrong. It's just that it's different. But that difference is important because sometimes that difference can become a barrier to sharing. We just assume that everybody hears, thinks, and frames things the way I do as a literate, educated American, middle class. But that's not true, is it?
Yeah, and I think, when you get the nations together, and let's say you're trying to worship together as nations, you want to celebrate the different cultures that are there, and yet at the same time you want to challenge them to sacrifice their personal preferences that are tied to that. So in our church, we have several nations trying to worship together, so we're going to challenge the congregation to sacrifice their personal preferences of what songs they like or what type of music they like, because we all like different types of music. At the same time, though, our worship pastor, he's going to try to do music that reflects different cultures and different languages. So we're asking the church to sacrifice your preferences that might just be tied to your worldview and not bring those in and say that this has to go this way. But then as church leadership, we want to try to celebrate some of those differences and minister to those different cultures at the same time.
Well, fortunately, in the American church, we don't have any problem with, preferences and those kinds of things.
Oh, yeah. That's the easy part.
Yeah. It's not like we all prefer the same thing, and that doesn't create any problems for us just among folks that are alike. Yeah. So this idea of learning to value the differences, to realize that those differences are meaningful to them, they're important, and we want to celebrate that. We don't want to just tolerate it, I think is really important. As you came back, and as you surveyed the Houston landscape, what similarities did you notice between Houston as it is today, the most ethnically and culturally diverse metropolitan region in the United States, and the mission field where you served?
Actually, not many similarities from Japan. Japan was so different, except it's a first world country. Japanese people are very wealthy, just very similar to America in that sense. But when I was in Mobile, Alabama, I'd like to kind of compare all three places. Okay. Mobile, we would go door to door and share the gospel. And on average, we could share the gospel, and 10% of the doors that we knocked on would respond to the gospel. We would almost, it was just like clockwork. Every summer I had mission teams that would come in and we'd just go canvass the city and knock on doors. 10% would respond. Of course, in Japan, that was unheard of. This past summer, we knocked on 250 doors in Southwest Houston, and nobody responded to the gospel.
Wow.
Just the contrast between Mobile, Alabama, and Houston, Texas, and out of 250 doors, we met the world, from Buddhists, Hindus, Muslim. we met so many different nationalities, and it was very difficult to just even try to have a conversation at the door, let alone for someone to respond to the gospel. And I felt like I'm back in Japan. Our city is so diverse, bringing the religions their culture, and that's where we've got to start. We've got to start at a different place than Mobile, Alabama.
Good insight.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of differences, of course, anywhere you go, and between the jungles of Houston and the city jungle of Houston and the jungles of Peru, I guess. I think there's a lot of differences, but I've been thinking about this question this week as we've been preparing for today, and one of the similarities I see, or one of the common things that probably all of you could notice in your ministry fields, is the idea that there's spiritual warfare going on, and therefore there's fear that exists. And so with the animistic people group in Peru, they lived in constant fear. If you just looked at them, they might just seem like families that like to hunt and fish and enjoy each other. But as you get to know them, they lived in fear every day. Fear of not having enough food, fear of the harvest not coming in, fear of there not being enough rain, fear of a sickness and there's no treatment, fear of evil spirits. And so they lived in constant fear. And I come here to Houston and I see the same thing in the families of our church and the families of our city. We live in this constant fear of the stock market crashing, fear of unemployment, fear of sickness, fear of what's going to happen to my kids. And so we put them in these little bubbles because we're so fearful. And it's the same thing that exists. And so what gives me comfort, though, is therefore we have the same response. And that is, like you said, buddy, the gospel. And we were talking earlier this week on the phone how the reason we're having this conversation is not just because there's lots of nations in Houston, but it's because there's lots of lost nations in Houston. If everybody in Houston were believers, we probably wouldn't spend all this time talking about how to reach the nations of Houston. But the truth of it is, those 350 nations you mentioned, Tom, they're lost. And they're living in fear, and they're living in spiritual warfare, and depression and anxiety are plaguing our city, and they need the gospel. And so when you talk about all these nations that have almost nothing in common, we like different foods, we like different types of songs, everything's different. The one thing that can unite us, the one thing that we can have in common is the gospel of Christ. And so I think, the mission is the same. It's reaching the nations with the gospel because they're desperate for it. And it's speaking to the heart of that fear. At the end of the day, it's still families. That's one thing that I've seen at our church is it's easy on a Sunday morning to see your congregation gathered and just kind of let it all blur together as this one big group. But it's during the week when you start to see that one group consists of single moms and widows and this family and this man who just lost his job and this family that's facing eviction. You're reminded that at the end of the day, whatever nation it is, whatever city you're in, it's families who are struggling with sin and fear and who need the gospel. And so I think the mission stays the same. How we approach it might be different, but the mission's constant,
Now, you all benefited from the training that you received with the International Mission Board and the preparation for going to the mission field. As a pastor, I didn't have that. And a lot of these folks and a lot of the people that will watch this video will not have that kind of training. So where can we learn the things that we need to know? What are the things that we need to know? Where can we learn some of those things?
Well, the UBA has a lot of good training.
Thank you.
And I'm encouraged by the things that I see. But there is so much to be said about learning about culture. If in Japan, before I went to Japan, I learned how to share the gospel through the 4 spiritual laws. The first question is, God loves you and offers a wonderful plan for your life. And well, that's not a question, it's a statement. That's the first thing that says. And if I had shared that with a Japanese person, in their mind, their worldview is, which God are you talking about? I mean, they have, it's the land of 10,000 gods. And so in their mind, which God are you talking about? We have such a plethora of places that we can learn about a people group's culture. Who are around us? Who are the people around our church? And it doesn't take maybe a few minutes to go and learn a little bit about their customs, about their culture, about the way they live, and then take the gospel and apply it. The gospel is the same. We might have to start at a different place. We have to start at the beginning, at Genesis, instead of starting in Matthew.
Right.
And to share the gospel, we need to tell them about the God who created the world. We need to identify God. So perhaps that's a place that we can just start, is learning about our people groups that are around us.
learning about the people group and then learning how to share the gospel from within their frame of reference instead of from within ours, right?
And I think one of the ways to do it is to learn from the nationals. I think one of the beautiful things, even about UBA, and you look around this room, is we have pastors in this room from different nations.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd be some of the first ones that we should probably be eating lunch with and asking them, how do I reach the Vietnamese in my community? How do I reach the Nigerians in my community? And sit down with some of these pastors of different nationalities and learn from them. My first year at Willcrest, I made our whole staff spend every Thursday morning at the tea house down the street. I'd never heard of a tea house. I'd never seen the tea with the big old giant straws with the little balls that suck up with the tea. And so I wanted to learn this culture, And so every Thursday morning, instead of being in the office where we can't, see the community, we would spend those mornings at the Vietnamese tea house down the street and experience the culture, the tastes and the smells and the languages and the sounds of the city, and just be with them. And so I think sitting with pastors, going to those places that maybe are outside your comfort zone. And then, of course, there's no substitute, I think, for just getting in people's homes. I was reminded about this 2 weeks ago. We went on a mission trip to Uganda, and we were with the Karamojong tribe in Kabong, Uganda. And the way they build their huts is a very defensive construction. So they put all these fences around the fences and then more fences. And to get to someone's home, you literally have to get on the ground and crawl through this tiny door through these wooden fences to get in. And they do that to protect themselves because it's going to make it a lot harder for raiders to attack them if they build their houses that way. So if you go through all of that work of crawling on the dirt to get to their home, you're part of the family once you get to their home. And the same is true here. If you go through the work of fighting traffic for 30 minutes to get to somebody's home on a Tuesday night, and you sacrifice your time with your spouse and your children, and you take off your shoes and you go in and you sit with them for 3 hours, you drink some kind of tea that you don't like, well, you're part of the family. And you just got to know their culture. You got to appreciate where they're coming from. I spent one afternoon one time with a older Cuban couple from my church, and they made me sit down in their apartment. They made me drink strong coffee. I don't even drink coffee. And they made me watch them dance together. They put on the song they danced to at their wedding, and this 80-year-old Cuban couple just danced in front of me while I drank coffee, and that was the best way I could minister to them. And I tell you, I learned a little bit of the Cuban culture that day. So I think getting into the homes, there's no substitute for that.
Well, let's wrap this part of it up by just providing you an opportunity. If you could only say one or maybe two things to UBA pastors or to those watching the video that you think would be really important, one point you just really want to drive home, what would it be?
Two things. One is I believe that it's a spiritual battle here. Unless we can go out and share the gospel, which we must, the gospel is the power unto salvation. But it is a spiritual darkness, and the word tells us that our weapons are not of this world. Our weapons are powerful to demolish strongholds, to take down the things that we think against God, and that's what we're fighting against. Is the religious strongholds, the false religions that are here. And I believe that prayer is really something that we've got to capitalize on more as a major weapon against the darkness. The second thing is I believe that we have a huge opportunity ahead of us. We grieve that 600 to 800 missionaries are having to come back from the field with the International Mission Board. I was there, and it grieved me whenever I felt like the Lord was saying, come back, and I thought, in my own mind, Lord, there will be nothing more satisfying than what I'm doing now. Why would you send me back? Why do I have to go back? And I know that they're struggling with those things. I believe that the opportunity, God, does not surprise God. He had this already planned. And his plan, I believe, is that he's already brought the nations to us. And so now he is bringing part of the body back to help us with this darkness, with this cross-cultural need, and to train the body of Christ to be part of winning the world that's come right here. we as the body of Christ, I think, need to look at ways. How can we as churches in Houston, Texas, invite many of those brothers and sisters to be a part of our staff, part of our church? How do we support them? They need meaningful employment. They need a way to be able to support their family, but yet at the same time to continue to do the call that God has put on their life, which is cross-cultural ministry, and which is a little bit different than being a pastor. Mm-hmm. And so they need the opportunity to be able to be who they are in reaching the nations, and that's a challenge for all of us.
Absolutely.
And bringing them here, I am praying that the Lord will bring many, at least 25 of those missionaries just to work with us in our small church. And I tell you, we've only been in existence for 5 months, and we have about 20 on a good day. We meet in a living room. But I'm asking the Lord, I mean, you can provide for them. Mm-hmm. So bring at least 25 to work with us. There's 600 to 800 of them. So you pick 50 or 100, okay?
Yeah. Well, and you identified some things that they need, and I think it's important for us to hear it. They need a place to live. They need transportation because they're coming back. They don't have cars here. And they need a meaningful ministry, a chance to serve. And I think those are some ways that we can help some of these returning missionaries. I know David Platt has talked about a reset of the International Mission Board. And if you've not read it, you can go to imb.org. You can see the explanation for what's gone on. Basically, the International Mission Board has been spending out of their reserves. They've been selling property overseas in order to help keep missionaries on the field. They anticipated a reduction in the missionary force through retirement. And they had reduced the force from, about 5,600 to about 4,800. But they've, in order just to keep it there, they've had to sell a lot of the property. They've gone into their reserves. And so now they've reached the point where they can't continue that strategy. And so they've initiated what they call a volunteer retirement initiative, VRI, and a voluntary retirement initiative that's not really a retirement package, as I understand it. So they're really bringing about 600 to 800 folks back. Folks had until Tuesday of this week, November 2nd, I think, to decide whether they were going to take it. So it's still very, very early in the process. We don't know how many folks will be coming. We don't know where they will want to come. We do know some of them have already contacted us. Some of them may have already contacted you all, as well as some of our other churches. But anything that we can do to help provide a place to live. Some churches have missionary housing, but those missionary houses are booked years in advance, I know. So we can't probably turn to that as a resource. So we need to be creative, find housing, find transportation, find a place where they can serve. And certainly this is something that we want to be in prayer about and do everything we can to help resource these folks.
Absolutely. Some of my friends are taking the retirement. Some of the IMB missionaries I've talked to that are taking it, it's coming at a good time. Some of them, it's been a prayerful struggle. But I think, like you said, Tom, we do need the churches in Houston to go and talk to their congregations and find housing and find cars, and then call the UBA and say we have these resources so we can get that to those missionaries so we can continue to support them as we always want to do. But also, I think, like you're saying, buddy, we want to trust God's sovereignty in it. Mm-hmm. As one missionary said, it's the first time in church history that 600 missionaries have gone to the same country at the same time. And so God's already brought the nations to the United States. And now, like you said, God's bringing the missionaries. And we want to see it as an opportunity to reach out. And it is important. And it's not just important to Houston because Houston's diverse. Even if Houston did not have 350 nations, I would hope that we would still be sitting around talking about our heart for the nations and God's heart for the nations and how to reach the nations. You know, we want to reach the nations not because of our demographics, but because the gospel calls for it. And, you know, because of the Great Commission, because of Ephesians 2 and Galatians 3 and the vision of Revelation 7. So we want to reach out to these peoples, and now God is bringing these missionaries to partner with us. One thing I always tell our church is we don't want our church to champion diversity. You know, I would be sad if someone came to Willcrest and they just left saying, how neat that there's lots of nations together. You know, that's not our goal. It's to just get the nations in one room. We've done that today. Starbucks does that every week. The Galleria Mall gets the nations together every single day. Our goal is not just to get the nations together to champion diversity. Our goal is to have our diversity say something about the gospel. Our goal is to say something about God's heart for the nations. And I think if we can partner with each other, if we can partner with these IMB missionaries coming back, like-minded people, well-trained, with a heart for all peoples, then I think because the gospel calls for it, then we can reach these lost nations with the gospel.
Fantastic. Well, time has come for us to close. Jonathan?